Hello.
Hello.
Hey. How's everybody today?
Woo!
Right. Ready to talk about authorship?
Woo!
Sight.
Cool. So welcome to the third installment of our panel, Does the Author's Intent Matter? Titled, So Really, Does the Author's Intent Matter? In video games, specifically. And that's a lot of people. I hope you're ready for, just talking and, answering like one of the age-old questions of our, well, I wouldn't say time because video games have been around, but you know what? Let's just get to it. On our panel today, we have Lena, Raine.
Hello. Should I say something?
Yeah, sure.
Hi.
And also to my right directly, we have Triolo, sometimes known as Moom, on the internet, if you're online.
Hello.
Video games. Oh, I should have put up your Twitter icon because that's like, yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah. And we also have Jeff Gerstmann.
Hi, hello. Howdy.
Also, there's me. This is what I usually look like. So we have a nice little panel of folks who have made and talked about and sometimes both video games and related products. So let's just get onto the discussion of, because there's the whole like death of the author thing's been around for a while, but video games are kind of a specific thing, both because of the like layer of interactivity and also the fact, there's multiple people who can engage with them at the same time. And also sometimes it's not just one author writing a book, but maybe 300 people, each like throwing a little stick on the fire. And, maybe that makes the question a little bit more complex. So, does the author's intent matter in video games?
If you want it to. Yeah, I think that's you're right about the level of interactivity, right? That's something that like people bring themselves to a game in a lot of cases. I think way more than most other mediums, and so you've got people's experiences to account for, especially when we're talking about multiplayer games and that sort of stuff that are like maybe a little less narrative focused. The player experience. You see more and more studios, especially they get into generated content and multiplayer focused stuff, saying like we're about the player's stories, which is oftentimes feels like code for we didn't write anything, but sometimes it's a mix of both. But that was like the big story with Destiny when Destiny was coming out. There was like we care about the player's stories, and it's like okay, well, what were you trying to say with Destiny? Which is a murkier question, I think, in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think it both have to matter, I think, when it comes to video games. Not to just provide what I feel is the actual answer to the question, but I think you kind of have to have it both ways when it comes to video games, and it's going to be different for different games.
Yeah, I definitely like, bouncing off of that, like especially for games where it's like you are, you're providing something for people to interact with, right? And so ultimately, like when that's released and when people are playing it, like that's when it sort of finally comes into sort of the final version of what it is. While it's in development, like it's kind of almost never finished until the person is playing it. And so I feel like the audience kind of brings a part of themselves to it, and that sort of making those games that have more of a the player's intent, or like the paths that they can take in like choice-driven games or in multiplayer sorts of things. Like they bring their own kind of authorship to it in a certain way, and so there's very much the intent of the people that created it and creating the choices through which that the players can actually engage with and make their own sort of intent. And a lot of the stronger, I feel, games that sort of pull that off is like, when the authors of the game have created a situation where the players can feel like their own sort of author of the game in a certain way, and they can sort of take that and sort of run with it in that sort of way. So I feel like it kind of becomes a multifaceted thing once you release it to the public and you're sort of letting people play through games that have that ability to channel themselves into it.
For what it's worth, I think it's interesting to consider it in the context of how to put it. When you're making a multiplayer game, for example, and we're talking about user stories.
Yeah.
How much of that does the author's sort of intent come into play in terms of trying to create a situation, a context in which user stories can exist or not be extremely toxic user stories?
Right. And that's, I mean, in my eyes, that's kind of where it gets into, author's intent needs to matter in those cases, because the things that you communicate in the game, the tone in which you approach the ways in which a player can interact with your game, that intent extremely matters, because that sort of defines how people are going to behave around others that are also playing the game. It fuels that community in a certain way, and so even extends to things like for MMO online games or even just shared universe sorts of games, how you run community management, how you do all these things that sort of sets the tone for the game, and all of those people are in that matter are kind of authors kind of bringing their own thing into that and creating that setting through which the players can experience the game.
Yeah.
So there.
And I think the thing I would say is, you when you get back into what we think of as more traditional games, the kind of narrative-driven, maybe single-player focus, stuff like that. I tend to think of it as just generally speaking, when we're talking about big games, maybe big games more than small games, or maybe mainstream is actually what I mean to say, as opposed to just big games. I think I tend to think of it as the consumer shouldn't have to go out of their way to find these sort of statements. So I've always felt if there's something about a game where hey, maybe the statement of the intent of just hey, this is what we mean by this isn't always going to be clear, maybe spell it out. If it ends up being something that is crucial to say hey, we want to make sure you have at least are aware of our interpretation of the events we have created.
Yeah.
Then I feel like it should be part of the package.
Yeah.
And kind of right there, even if it's just as much as hey, in the credits we literally have a statement of intent. And I think that helps, because if you're not doing that, you can't. I feel like it's a little hard to then go back after the fact and be dismayed by how people have taken the game. It's okay, well, if you've left it ambiguous and people are taking it a way that you're uncomfortable with, in some ways that can reflect on the design or some of the choices made along the way.
And even just the way that developers talk about their games before they've come out, the thing that definitely sort of reminds me of what you're talking about is this sort of the Division 2, and kind of how they're sort of making that decision, we're not trying to say certain things with that, but you're through the context of the game, you can tell that there is that context there. Clearly that was thought about in the development of a game, but then to sort of wipe that away, when you're actually talking about the game and say no, it's up to you, whatever. It's sort of giving away that intent and making it only sort of determined by the people that are consuming it. It kind of takes away that, they're trying to absolve themselves of the responsibility. Yeah,
I was going to say, that one really feels hey, we're going to take the heat off of ourselves here by just saying what? No, we just said it in the Capitol. I don't know, the world's crazy, but is it our world? I don't know, who could say? That stuff. I feel a more powerful statement on their behalf would be way more interesting to me as a player.
Yeah.
Even if that maybe limits some of the players' interpretations along the way, I still think that there's power in kind of coming out there and saying no, this is what we're actually trying to say with the game.
Yeah.
And I think you can have it both ways. There are definitely plenty of different stories to tell around that world if they had just kind of owned it and said, yeah, we understand that this work is inherently political because, that would be a more interesting setup. And I'm still looking forward to the game. I mean, that said, like, I think they're doing something interesting. But if they had gone for it, is the phrase I think we use a lot, that would be way more exciting.
I feel like it's a little tricky too to like determine intent a lot of times when it comes to AAA games, especially because like it's not just like thousands of people working on the game, but you can also have situations where someone's like inherited someone else's job who inherited someone else's job, and it's like, okay, we have all these decisions locked in, we have no idea why these were made.
Yeah, like I can definitely speak to that. Like I can't speak specifics, because of, company NDAs and all of that stuff. But like, I worked at Ubisoft for a while, and so like there's certain things that are just like, there's the internal hierarchy at play, especially with AAA, and there's always just kind of like, there might be an intent behind one specific person working in this giant 300, 400, 500 strong, development team. And I certainly had my attempt at author's intent when I was working, doing design work. And, and then, I discovered when the game shipped, like half of the stuff that I worked on was gone. It was like all of that, that's kind of like that. It really is sort of down to like who is managing the game, who's sort of making decisions at the upper, the higher end. Are they more interested in collaborating with the people that are sort of like on the floor, so to speak? And it's not to badmouth anyone involved in the process, but it's kind of like, how is the studio constructed? Like, what is the makings? What is the internal structure of the company, and like how is that development team function, and who's calling the shots?
And the priorities, it could be a case, like I don't know the specific, but like, hey, maybe it was a case of like, oh, well, actually,
this is going to take forever to develop, so we can't actually follow through on this.
If we take this out, it serves the game's design better if we remove this narrative element.
Extremely,
I'm thinking about Vice City, for example. Like that's their retelling of 80s crime dramas, and in the vast majority of those, when you look at like, hey, let's make a game because we like Scarface, it doesn't go well for him at the end of that film. But when you're making an open world game, the expectation has become
you have to do well.
You have to be able to play after the credits roll.
Right, yeah.
So it has to be a case of like, oh, well, when you finish the story, you might want to go back and do the rest of the side stuff, so we can't lock you out. So like if you go back and play the last mission of that game, it is this triumphant nonsense like that. At the time, you're like, whatever, I'm just gunning down all of these mafia thugs that came from up north and we're taking care of it. But when you look at it, it's just like they ride off into the sunset like, I'm a good drug dealer. And you're like, way to go, Tommy, you did it. And then it just dumps you back into the world unceremoniously, like, and now go drive a taxi for a while, or whatever it is, because that's open world gaming, or at least it was in that era.
Sure.
I always had a better respect. I always enjoyed it when games would just kind of roll back time and just admit, like, hey, we want to write our ending, but we understand that you need to play the rest of the game.
Right. It's like, this is before the point of no return.
Yeah.
You're just going to go back there and keep doing that forever.
Yeah. So when you play Wildlands, when you finish that, it will roll back to a time, but you can always go do the final mission again.
Yeah.
And so it just kind of says like, this is before that happened. If you wanted to do the rest of the side stuff, you could go do it.
Well, that kind of thing also like makes the exceptions to that stand out to a lot. For me, like Red Dead Redemption is like one of those like ones where it's like, hey, we have an entirely different like setup for who your character is. Like when you're playing through things. Spoilers for a very old game, I guess, but very old, relatively.
Ancient history.
Ancient history.
Cowboys. They don't make them anymore.
Sequel's going to come out.
Yeah.
I should have mentioned there could be spoilers.
Sorry.
But yeah, it's also interesting to think about the idea that sometimes authors may want to be upfront about like what you're trying to say through something, but they choose not to either because like, oh, maybe the person or entity paying for it doesn't want to take that risk, or like it seems to me like is there actually like a safe range where like now like we can like people can make like can fully take a risk in terms of like this is exactly what I'm trying to say through this, because it seems that if you're too big then you have to please like risk-averse like organizations. And if you're too small, you can say what you want, but it's way easy. It's like way harder to actually like deal or face criticism online because you don't have organizations or lots of people who are there to like help prop you up, or like you're just one person on Twitter with an unpopular opinion.
That's me. I'm on Twitter with that unpopular opinion. That's why Red Dead's bad. No. Yeah, I think it's something that it's probably a lot easier to have authorial intent when there is an author, and obviously the larger the team size gets, that stuff gets spread around. There's the duties of just like who's calling the shots, and how much of that is really left up to them, and how much of it is kind of in the rest of the team's hands and stuff. So I think you probably see different forms of that depending on the priorities of a team, depending on the size of a team, the scope of the game, what they're trying to do narratively, all that sort of stuff. So I think you're going to end up just across the board different answers to that question. Like every team, even the same team on their next game may stumble or will likely stumble upon a different answer to that question, I would think.
Yeah, and I think within AAA space, especially lately, I feel like you see a sort of quiet conflict between more marginalized people who are sort of in the trenches and management who's maybe not 100% sold on allowing those people authorship, even when talking about things that apply to those people. And sometimes that pushback can be well-meaning, but it's still you occasionally end up in situations where people hey, here's my game that just shipped. Also, it's really shitty to people like me.
Yeah, I can definitely feel that. Working in AAA and stuff, and I've thankfully had the opportunity to work for companies that are kind of just we're just steamrolling for doing our own thing, but then also ones that are kind of slightly more able to work with developers and kind of make sure that those voices are heard in the company and then also in the content that comes out. And one interesting sort of anecdote, I guess, to speak to is when I was working on Guild Wars 2 at ArenaNet, and this was right sort of around when the game shipped, and we were kind of working on the first patch, story content and stuff. And we had two characters that were sort of part of the main group that for the story content, and they were lesbians, and we wanted to have them kiss. And it was a thing where if I was making my own game, obviously there's going to be lesbians because I'm a lesbian, whatever. But to actually do that in the game, we had to kind of go through those layers of approval, right? Where it's okay, now we need to talk to our lead, and okay, now we started animating it, and now the head of the company is here to take a look and make sure that it sort of fits with our company goals or whatever. And ultimately it got approved, and everything, hey, we've got this cool not pre-rendered, but pre-animated cutscene where our lesbian characters get to kiss and are being very authentic in their relationship, but the amount of effort that it took to kind of get to that point, very much sort of speaks to that ability to get that author sort of voice, through a large company.
Yeah, because it's constantly something that's an important thing that's constantly repeated is you need to let marginalized people tell their stories, but also in big companies then it's
there needs to be that push on or that just kind of not necessarily push, but just that intent on everyone's part. It has to be a collective intent to be yes, we're going to have these stories and have them be told by the people that can tell them.
But marginalized people in management.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the only way.
I mean, yeah, I have in previous jobs I have literally been taken into a small room by HR. It's just we want to make sure that if we you've been talking about diversity and such, and it's cool, but if we give you a project that is offensive to you specifically, you'll still work on it, right?
Why would you make? That's business, I guess, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, at the time, it's like, I assume at some point in servicing industry, like, hi, we're going to make this game that's offensive to a bunch of people. We would like to hire you to make it. And at some point, someone says, sure. Not in so many words, but, you know.
That's how you're the lead designer of Postal 2. No, I don't know. Yeah. That stuff's, I'm sure, all over the place.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, this is the sort of stuff that when we talk about like reactions to work and stuff like that, that I think it's, you know, the internet, social media, the exchange of ideas, if you will, is kind of both good and bad for this sort of thing. You know, I think you have more people kind of discussing the intent of a work, but also I think you have people that will, oftentimes it's hard to tell if they're just missing the point or just deliberately acting in bad faith to just like undermine what is kind of the clear through line of a work to try to bend it to their own ideals.
Yeah, there's definitely that. There's that sense of like people trying to place their own intent upon the author.
Totally.
In sort of a, you know, I see what you did there sort of way of just, you know, being like, you're actually crusading against, you know, white people. I don't know, like.
Yeah, or whatever it is. Yeah, and you know, I think some of that ties into the concept of like the bad fan and stuff like that. You know, you talk about Scarface or stuff like that. Like they're definitely. And you know, I've been like this with certain works where like I watch the movie Heat and turn it off before the end. It's like, De Niro got away. That guy, he's one of the good criminals. I like that guy. What if I could be like him? And then when the actual story is like, no, fucking don't, dumbass. You bank robber. Or you know, like you think about, I think some of that stuff even just gets into like the bad fan thing specifically. Like, you know, like. There's still examples of this today, but I feel like there was a rise. I'm trying to think what year it was. There was a documentary on HBO called Pimps Up, Hoes Down. And it came at a time when, like, that was, you know, Pimp My Ride, all this other stuff. Like, there was just, there was an era when people were just literally like, yeah, pimps. These guys, smooth talkers, why can't I be like that? And you're like, no, look at what that's literally, you know, and you watch that documentary and there's, along the way, they're trying to say like Don the Magic Wand literally says, the penitentiary comes with all this. Like they have lines in there saying like, hey, this is a crime. But the takeaway from that was like, I've got my favorite pimp from the documentary, what's yours? And, you know, I don't necessarily think the makers of that documentary were going into that going like, let's showcase the wacky pimps. They're great. It was more like, these are fascinating individuals that maybe you should know more about, but also they're pimps. But I don't know. It feels like we had to go through Pimp My Ride and like an era of just like people using that phrase in that way to eventually theoretically get it out of our systems and stuff like that. Yeah, wear it out. I guess actually, yeah. So it's probably due for a comeback any day now.
Oh no.
With the way this stuff seems to work, but like that's the stuff that when I think about like authorial intent and stuff like that, it does kind of eventually filter into that kind of that bad fan mentality of just like, you know, or you know, and in some cases they're not doing it deliberately, but just like interpretations of a work that are so far off the pace of like the person who just like Fight Club, that's me. Like, no, don't, no. And that sort of stuff, like, I think kind of goes hand in hand with some of that stuff, especially these days as we look at kind of some of the reactions to some of the different things that have been in games as of late. You see a lot of people that are just trying to be, like, willfully blinders on when it comes to certain types of material.
Yeah.
I think there's kind of a side angle on that, too, which is, like, situations where the author is kind of trying to neutralize a topic, be like, oh yeah, there's no context to this war game set in America. Definitely no politics here, right, everybody? No, there's definitely politics there. And
I think I get it. Like, you know, if you think about the history of games and shooting in games and conflict in games, like you go back far enough, the graphics, the scope, the setting just gets reduced down to just like, this green guy is going to shoot this other slightly differently colored green guy, and then someone's going to get a point. And so I get why some people think that like that can still be like, it's like a throwback, you know, it's like it's just fun. And it's like, well, no, like we're at a point now visually, production-wise, all other stuff that like there's inherent baggage with all this, right? I mean, it just kind of happens.
Yeah, I was actually on a podcast a while back where we were talking about like the sort of artistic intent involved in the way violence is portrayed in games specifically, where like I don't think a lot of people realize just how softened it is. Like actual hyper-realistically depicted violence is genuinely frightening. And like, there's people who spend a lot of time like just thinking about, okay, how do we make this violence exciting? How do we make it palatable, right? And that stuff has become so baked into games. A lot of people, even in games, don't quite understand how they're perpetuating like this sort of, hey, love me some murder.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's always been kind of like a weird thing for me, especially, you know, when it comes to like, you know, hey, first-person shooters are such a thing, right? And then, you know, guns are actually terrifying and they suck. And it's like being in sound design, like there's such a thing, like, you know, there's like a group of sound designers that, you know, get together to just, I mean, I'm not saying this is a literal group, but like, you know, people discuss in the sound design communities, like how do you make a really satisfying gunshot? And it's just like, I can't, like I get, you know, like that's the intent of those, you know, those games is to make, you know, shooting things feel satisfying, but it's also just kind of like, it makes you sort of step back a little bit and be like, oh, we're sexing up, you know, bullets being shot out of a weapon very fast, and it's like, you know, how do you do that in a satisfying way, but then also like, I don't know, kind of divorce yourself from the actuality of it.
Yeah.
You know, I haven't found that.
That
so.
was, yeah. So I saw, they showed it at E3. When they first showed it at E3, a game called Black that came out on the PlayStation 2 and
yeah.
Xbox. It was first-person shooter. It was, I feel like it was among the first where, like, they had it in a private demo room off the floor, and they just had this room full of speakers. And they were like, we really put a lot into the audio of these guns. And that was the game where they were literally starting to use the phrase gun porn. And they were just like, we want every bullet to feel like it matters. And it was just like so over the top. But like you look at it, and especially go back to it now, and like it looks corny. You know, it doesn't look, you know, like, except for the models of the guns.
Right.
Where they were just like meticulously, lovingly crafted, and it's like, oh, the casing ejects out just like a real gun.
I want to be the Forza of guns.
Yeah, Gun Forza would have been a way cooler term. So I'm working on that. So I'm gonna get into that. But yeah, and it's hard because I enjoy first-person shooters, and to me, I always liken like multiplayer first-person shooting to like going to the laser tag place.
Yeah.
You know, it's just, here's this very empty thing, and I can just respawn it, and it's very easy to not think about it until you think about it, and then you're like, yeah, this is probably not great, and it's a lot, and that's been, you know, that's been gaming. It's been one of gaming's most dominant forms, certainly for the past 20 years, if not more. But, you know, that it goes back to some of these very basic conflicts. You know, you take it back to Space Invaders, you take it back to Outlaw, all this other stuff. It's literal just like, here's two stick figure cowboys gunning it out at each other. Like it's a inherently easy to understand conflict, which is probably says some bad things about society also.
Sure.
But there it is, you know, and it is very baked into the fabric of gaming. And I go back and forth. Like on one hand, it's like, I don't know that I necessarily want it out of the fabric of gaming, because I think that there is something about that, especially in a multiplayer setting, of just like, hey, I aimed better. We did this, that skill. We had this skill off, and then you fell over. Right. I don't necessarily need it to be like super realistic or gory though either. Like, you know, I think I'm not a huge Fortnite player, but I really like, it's one of the things I respect about that game is just like, you know, and you might actually say this is worse in some ways, they've like removed it back a step to where it is less visceral than, let's say, even a PUBG or something like that. But at the same time, it is still like, check out what this shotgun did. And so maybe that's not so great in some other ways. Yeah, it's all very complicated, obviously. But you know, I think that when it comes to stuff like that, I don't know that you have. Well, I guess I wouldn't know. You know, I don't make games, but I tend to think that the people making those games and making those decisions aren't always thinking about it at that level. Like, is there authorial intent in check out how sick this gun is? Like, only insofar as that it's a great marketing bullet point of just like, these guns are sick. Like, we went out to a range, we mic'd it and did this, and we got all the best sound effects, and the ricochets sound all real, you know? Like, they're just doing that for the same reason that the people making Forza are putting mics under mufflers and all that other stuff. They want it to be, they want their thing to feel real.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in a lot of cases, there's a lot of instances where people just kind of like, you know, their intent is not necessarily like it's the spotlight is shifted away from what someone else might bring to that, right? And so you know, especially for things where it's like they are their intent is to provide this sort of like really cool, fun experience, but the way in which they do that is not. It's not necessarily like what is the, you know, the driving force behind it. So it's like, you know, one thing that always comes to mind is just kind of like people like when you're younger and you're just kind of like drawing like badass things in like a sketchbook or something, like you mimic a lot of the things that you're seeing, and you're like, this is badass. Like, you know, you draw from all of these sort of like popular culture things that are sort of funneling you towards this representation of what you think is cool and exciting. And sometimes, you know, that bypasses the actuality of what that actual, like, you know, thing that you are depicting is. It's just the channeling the means to reach that exciting factor. And I think a lot of, you know, those sort of, I mean, you can call them thoughtless, but it's also just kind of like, it's things that kind of get into the mix without necessarily thinking really heavily about it, because it sort of comes along with that package of like, I saw this in a movie and it was amazing. You know, it's how a lot of things like trailer music gets perpetuated. It's like, this is what makes things exciting. You have a rise, goes, what? Yeah. And, you know, quick shots, John. Like, yeah. You know, you don't really think about necessarily like what you're literally doing and just, you know, doing every single time, but you know that that's exciting. You know that that is going to bring a reaction that you're sort of going for. And so, you know, you're, you know, in a lot of ways kind of going with that flow of like, this is what has worked to generate excitement, and I'm going to keep doing that. Yeah,
it leads to like, oh, you have like this movie style cool adventure with the puckish rogue who's like doing all these things, and as
right,
also,
it's that ingrained, you know, cultural identity, you know, and the cultural reference points that, you know, that is what creates that sort of hero's journey where it's like, okay, there's going to be a heroic man that goes to save a princess. Like, that is one of those sort of culturally ingrained things that is like, you don't think about that, you know, I mean unless you have sort of trained yourself to think around that, you know, that is just kind of a culturally assumed benchmark that like, of course there's going to be a hero, and of course they're going to save a girl. You know, it's that, you know, the sorts of things that, you know, when you call out those sorts of tropes, like that's, you know, those are the assumed things that we just kind of sort of take for granted in sort of creating that structure that is relatable to, you know, what everyone kind of assumes is like everyone else. So
yeah, and it's like, since it's so mechanically like not easy, but like it's one of the like the go-to mechanics of like, okay, here's like, if there is conflict with enemies, cool, here's you, enemies, interesting situation, enemies are defeated, go on, and that makes it, yeah, no, that's how you make a game usually. Make it more difficult, add more enemies, like, oh, now there's the big enemy, and at the end of the story, the like friendly looking guy just, yay, I did it, and has also like killed 500 people.
Of course, yeah, I mean, that's, and it's interesting because games have, the way that games have come to where they are now is by sort of increasing the layers of, or decreasing the layers of abstraction as time goes on. Because, you know, when games were early, it was very much just kind of those abstract things that like you could just kind of infer a conflict. And, you know, it was, you know, sort of, you know, drawing things in very big, like colorful blotches, and then sort of detailing things out as you go along, and as you start adding more and more details as games kind of increase their production value, increase their realism, like then you start to realize, oh, this thing I've been drawing all this time is actually kind of gruesome. But in the beginning, it was just kind of a stick figure, right? And so it's an interesting thing to kind of observe, like these are the common things that have been developed in video games, over time, and especially for series that have been going on for like forever, like you get. Mario, right, as an example, like, and this is not going into a negative direction. Like he doesn't, pull out guns and shoot people. Like, he's still, just a friendly cartoon man that like jumps on things' heads. But like the sort of the levels of abstraction have decreased over time. So it's like, who knows, where he's walking in the beginning? Like he's just, going down a road and there's some bricks in the air. But now, in Mario Odyssey, you've got, here's an actual city. Here's bricks that are floating because that's the rules of Mario. And so you've seen how that's developed over time, and I feel like that happens in a lot of other different places, like especially with first-person shooters. Things developing from these. Very, more abstracted sources, and then increasing that over time and sort of seeing like, oh, here's how we got here, and like looking at that history, I think is really interesting especially when you're sort of deciding like, what is my intent for this next thing that I'm going to create? Looking at sort of where things have come and, whether you're just kind of following that path or deciding to make a change.
Yeah, and like you can tell in Mario Odyssey that there was like at some point like, oh, we have realistic looking people now. Do we let
Mario?
Yeah. Do we let Mario just take over the person? Like, wait. At some point, someone went, we have to make sure that Mario can't just control a realistic looking person and have them walk off a cliff. That might be a step too far.
Yeah, and so and you can see in how they chose to create that game. You can see their intent of what they chose to let Mario control and do as those things. And that's where the important part comes in, I think, is, you can't, like you said, control a man and have, him, go like harass someone on the street or something. Like, that's not what they chose to do with that game, but you can have him like control a guy who's using a remote control car. Like, that's something Mario would do. And so you're able to sort of, as an author, create the experiences that, you feel comfortable for that interaction, I think.
And that seems like something Nintendo's been very good at. When you think about like the through line of like their characters, their intellectual property, those franchises, in terms of just like the general tone of what those characters have been able to do, as they have like increased the resolution of the world to a point that it looks more and more realistic. Like they're still on that track in a lot of ways in terms of just like, oh no, this is still what Mario is as a person, whatever Mario is. He doesn't. It's hard to even know anymore. And the rules of that world as they flesh it out. And I think that's obviously that's their intent all along.
It definitely sort of owes itself to that sort of oversight, right, of the company. Like you have those strong creative forces that are sort of like still defining those rules and those sort of tone for those sort of things. Like Kirby is still going to be just extremely cheerful and fun and aimed towards kids. Like, and that's awesome.
And even just like the Zelda games and stuff. Obviously, this last one, like the scope is dramatically different from what's come before it.
Yeah.
But it still feels like it fits in that universe, and that's that's because of the deliberate choices they made about, okay, here's what Link can do here, here's the sorts of items we are going to give you, the player, to control, and how you will interact with the world. Even though it's plenty of new types of interactions for this franchise, it still fits with like what you think of as the tool set of this character on this quest.
Yeah.
And I think that's. When you think about other franchises and how many times they change hands, different leads and all this other stuff, and just over the course of a single project even, I think that there's something to, their ability to kind of stay on that course over all these years. Even if some people are like, I want the Zelda where they're cutting people's heads off, like
the mature Mario.
Finally, mature Mario, mature Zelda, let's go. That they've been able to kind of find a way to stay on that course and keep it exciting and interesting along the way. It's tremendous, and I don't know that they necessarily get enough credit for that specific thing along the way.
Yeah, and then there's Bomberman Zero.
Yeah, on the opposite side of it, you have Bomberman Act Zero, where they're just like, we're gonna make this edgy ass Bomberman. It's gonna be so badass. We went out and microphoned a bomb, and it's gonna be the realest, realest shit you've ever seen.
Fuse, whatever.
You hear it, it's crazy, and it's surround sound. Yeah, no, totally. You definitely like you get the gritty reboot of someone going like, how do we age this up? You know, like the kids that grew up with Bomberman, they don't love Bomberman as it is anymore. They like that crazy stuff. How do we make it raw? And then they just make a miserable piece of garbage and go like, okay, no, we need to scale it all the way back to cutesy Bomberman and just make that game again and again until no one buys it anymore.
But it's been super interesting, like going back to the Nintendo thing, how like it's for a lot of projects, it's somehow like it comes easy to think of like, oh yeah, Nintendo, like the author of this game is Nintendo, or like, yeah, this is like, you can kind of almost see like the person that Nintendo is, even though sometimes for some project, oh, there's like still this person, but it's not as like much as this is the auteur who's like doing everything, but there's like a still some sort of like influence, and while still having stuff like, I don't know, like the Splatoon team, right? Like, kind of like, oh yeah, like the Splatoon team, those folks who make Splatoon, it might just be me, but I've never actually seen it associated with a specific person, but it's always interesting to see, yeah, they have like a very specific kind of aesthetic and almost like a different reasoning.
That team also makes Animal Crossing.
Oh. So, yeah, there's a wholesome through line.
I think the cool thing about Splatoon is, like, yeah, you're right. It's got that kind of fresh vibe that doesn't necessarily feel like everything else they've done, but it still fits into the catalog. And I think their ability to create that and have it not feel out of place. I mean, they literally made their own take on a competitive shooter. Yeah. You know, they said like, oh, here's the genre of the day. We can do that, but we can do it our own way and still have it fit within the kind of goals that we have as a company.
Still end up with something you can fit in a cart.
Sure.
And play with all the other properties.
Yeah. I think that's tremendous as well. That's it's you know they don't come out. Nintendo does not roll out new properties all the time. I think sometimes I wish they would do more of it. But when they pick their shots, generally speaking, I think they've done some. They've made a lot of really interesting choices along the way that still feel like them, and I think that's neat.
Cool. Would you like to answer some questions?
Sure.
Do you folks have some questions? I think there's a microphone. Hey, there's a person at that microphone. Nice.
For every game like Nier and Undertale, which everything down to those games' UI reflects our ethereal intent pretty clearly, you have 10 Far Cry 5s where your stated thing you're supposed to be doing and the thing you're actually doing are opposite. Doesn't the games industry kind of at large largely by its own choices at this point make the whole ethereal intent not matter because it just doesn't reflect? They say you're doing something, but you're not really doing that thing.
I think a lot of that tends to depend on like the structure of the studio, like how like authorial is the game director, for example, or the UI director, depending on how large the company is. Like some studios may have like 10 UI designers or something and multiple layers of middle managers in between everything, and just massively dilutes the result, whereas like maybe some studio, like the game director is like, no, this is what the UI looks like, make it, bye.
Well, yeah, it's like it's a kind of down to like how much control and how much input does a team allow for those, all the different aspects of it, like, especially, in the example of Nier, like, the level of dynamism that the soundtrack has, like, that wouldn't have been accomplished, under a team that didn't value the sort of authorship of the composer to come in there and sort of, create all of those opportunities to layer the music in certain ways. So it really does sort of speak to that, the leadership, and then also the structure of just kind of the team and what they allow for.
I think having a really strong sense of direction also really helps. Like, the less you kind of know as a whole team what you're trying to do artistically, the more scattered things tend to be.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you.
When it comes to the narrative of a game, Jeff, you mentioned games like Vice City that have these very victorious criminal protagonists, and they ride off into their drug dealing sunset or whatever. But nobody's getting on Twitter and arguing that these game studios promote criminal behavior in the political world, in the social context. And so what do you think the best way is to craft a fantasy scenario that also has that division where it's like, okay, we want to tell a story, but we're not promoting a real-world context of that same story?
I think if you want to remove it from a real-world context, it'd be easy to just set your game somewhere else and make an alien world and drag it out that way. You can still kind of tell your roguish stories in a sci-fi world if you wanted to, but I look at it as in most of that type of, well, I'm not going to say most, but I feel like in a lot of popular examples of that types of fiction, like the protagonist or the main character gets theirs in the end. A movie like Heat, the guy doesn't get away. Scarface, like these characters, like, and so you end up with that. In that case, you end up with some people who are still like performing some kind of hero worship over these bad guys. There are definitely people who came away from Breaking Bad going like, yeah, that guy did it his way. He made the best meth. I want to do that, but that's not the story. They're, deliberately kind of missing the story. So I think even plenty of video games have I wish I could name some, but I feel like plenty of video games have done that well along the way. Like Red Dead's actually a really good example of like, hey, you play as this character that's not good, but they get theirs. And I think that I appreciate stories that kind of stick to that, rather than just like, here's this like totally stakes-free, like, you're the bad guy, but the other guys were bigger bad guys and you killed all of them, so yay, it's just flat at that point. Like, what were you trying to say with that game other than, aren't these guns cool? The soundtrack is good. It's the 80s, hooray.
All right, cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry. Hi there. So first off, I am not going to feel bad if anyone wants to veto this question. It has a little bit of teeth, and I apologize ahead of time for that. There was a scenario, a scandal around authorial intent, I think it was earlier this year, maybe last year, around Red Strings Club, an indie title. And specifically what had happened is the game has this kind of jerky, almost villainous character dead name a trans character as part of the narrative. And when this was first discovered, it hit the news feeds. Everybody was up in arms about it. Everybody was angry about it. And then it came out that one of the writers was actually transgendered. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about how much the identity of the writer or how much research that person has done plays into authorial intent, especially around Red Strings Club.
I actually was considering bringing that up during the panel, but it sort of never wandered to that particular area. This is definitely a complicated question, though. I'm not sure if I can give like a one-size-fits-all answer right here, but like my general feeling is that to an extent it comes down to setting expectations. Like a big part of the reason that whole thing blew up was because there was just like a weird Twitter interaction between Devolver and Waypoint that just got very messy. But like I think there's like an AU version of this where it went okay because like people talked it out a little more. Like I think also, just for the record, like it's possible for something written by a trans person to like not be super great towards trans people. Like that's a valid thing. And number one, it doesn't make the thing or the person like inherently bad. Like there needs to be room for queer people to fuck up their own stories. But also like it's also okay to criticize those things. It's important to be able to criticize those things.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the major things is like, you know, with any sort of marginalized representation in games, it's like because there's so little and it's kind of a increasing volume. There's sort of there's more and more as folks are able to tell their stories. Like I feel like there has to be that room to fuck up and kind of, discuss that without, threats and these extremely like, negative responses to things that just kind of like try to ruin the careers of everyone involved. And it's like, that has consistently happened with a lot of games that sort of tackle very difficult subjects and they're very personal to their queer creators. Like, there needs to be sort of at least a volume of representation out there to kind of allow those, fuck ups to happen, minor or major, and to handle them in a sort of mature way, I feel.
Yeah.
Thank you guys very much.
Yeah, I think like the most because I'm constantly, I make things, a lot of different things, and I'm constantly terrified of messing up.
Right.
And to me, like the best I can hope for anyone who messes up is like if when they're like told like, hey, you did this like kind of crappy thing, like, oh, like just acknowledge it, try to fix it, and do better next time. And I think that's like that ought to like.
Right, it's not something that you're just like, well, now they can never work in this industry again.
No, it's like, it's like there's, we need a bigger, wider spectrum of responses, while still getting better.
Hi.
Hey guys. In video games, you have narrative and you have gameplay, and you have to try and find a way to make those things work together. Mafia 3 is a video game that I think had an amazing narrative focus and authorial intent that I was really behind, and I really dug it, but the gameplay of that game was lacking, I guess would be the way to put it. So what do you guys think about when a game comes out and it has this strong intent that you really connect with, but then the game is so lackluster or lacking? Do you make how do you come to terms with how you regard that game?
I think in my eyes, it's kind of like just how you explained it, where it's like, you can call attention to both things, right? You can say that this is, a really important, focus, a very important story, and the way that they told that story is really great. And you can still say that with the caveat of like, it's not that fun to play in certain ways. And I think both things are both valid. Like one doesn't disqualify the other, or vice versa.
It ends up being a case where, in that specific case, you might recommend it with the caveats of like, this is a really interesting story. Like they don't stick the landing on the gameplay at all, and you kind of have to suffer your way through it. But in some cases, that's worth it to see this like well-crafted story, and that's something that as games have gotten bigger and games have tried to do things like this. Like in some ways, I would actually probably say some similar things about Wolfenstein 2. Where the narrative and the story they told and just the bombast there is absolutely worth seeing, but by the end of that game, the gameplay is maybe worn out its welcome a little bit, and that's not that uncommon. Even in games that aren't necessarily trying to say something big and sweeping with their narrative, like there are plenty of games where you're like, man, the story's really good, but the gameplay runs out of ideas 2 hours in, or vice versa. Like, hey, this is really fun to play, but boy, this story has nothing going for it. I feel like that probably happens a little more frequently. That's like the Far Cry issue of just like, there's an interesting setup here that they never cash in on. Probably because they felt they had to make in some ways, because it seems like they had to make the gameplay all things to all people, because it's this big open world game and there's the expectations of it being a Far Cry and blah, 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 and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Sorry. A bit of a two-parter. Do you guys feel that authorship has a responsibility to do some sort of social good in the messages it portrays and the questions it asks?
I mean, in all, when I make things, I do my best to like leave the person who engages with my things in a better spot, but also like it's not always possible, and sometimes like, yeah, I think there's something to be said for the like overall trend. If like in general, like it's like the more you make things, the more you want your work to generally like just do good in general. It also means like sometimes like there's something to be said for pacing. Sometimes you just like want to make this little thing that may not be like and have an important message to you. You just, I really want to make this small thing, and I think that should be all right, if so long as like we can look at like your general oeuvre and see like, okay, yeah, no, there's.
Yeah, I think it, in a lot of ways it kind of depends like on what your intent is with, with making something. Like if you want to just make like a little arcade, sort of, for funsies sort of game that's like, it really has, it's all kind of abstracted. It's all just kind of just the clear intent of it is just, you're, in this very abstract setting, shooting things and getting points. Like, I think that's a totally valid thing to do. But once you sort of cross over the line into like, this is starting to say something, like, I feel like, doing that with good intentions is always the best way to approach it.
So then building off of that, we discussed the bad fan who interprets things in a negative light. What about the inverse of somebody puts out a work that is inherently transphobic or homophobic or something along those lines, and fans take one piece of it and be like, no, that's the message there, and it's this good, wholesome message instead. What are your thoughts on that? And how would that affect how you view a game?
It's a tricky thing because I think that especially for things that if you're going to say like if it's homophobic, transphobic, I think like ultimately that's not going to be a widespread opinion. Like it's not going to be the majority, I think, of people that agree upon that. I feel like the people that would put all of that aside to focus on like this one thing here is good is probably like there's going to be enough of a conversation around those bad things. I feel that I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but
it seems like you would have to deliberately shut out a lot of stuff.
Yeah, you'd have to put a lot of blinders on.
Maintain that view.
Yeah, and there are definitely people that have those inherent blinders set up, but I would like to hope that the greater society doesn't and is able to sort of call those things out and be able to sort of address them, because I feel like that's something that has happened a lot is people kind of like calling out certain things that are not great.
Yeah, there's like definitely been instances where like in a work that primarily like is pretty good, but there's like that's that smaller minor part that like it's just like is deeply flawed. There's like looking at it this way, saying like finding a way to reclaim it can be a way to just like play through and get to actually like enjoy the rest of the game. But also sometimes for me, I feel like it can be a constructive way to say like, I like this in general. This part's really shitty, but like if we look at it this way, or if it were presented in this fashion, it would probably be better, and just try to offer that as a way to constructively say like, hey, here's like next time something that could work better without like
shutting the entire thing out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Last question.
We've talked a lot about authorial intent and narrative. I'm not so sure if we talked at least too much in depth about authorial intent and mechanics. Is there a right way to play games? Is it quote unquote right to do stuff like speedrunning? Where you use as many exploits to break the game as much as you can.
Yeah.
Or my personal closest example that I'm most familiar with is the divide between different kinds of games, especially for me, between like Super Smash Bros. Melee and how thriving of a competitive scene there is, and how distinct that is from Sakurai's much more casual or less competitive aspirations for the game.
Sure. Yeah, I think that definitely crosses a lot of things that we didn't necessarily get to specifically. And I think, one of the things that I love about how games are developing is there is more of a consideration for people of wider, different abilities towards, playing games, to open that up to a lot, sort of wider group of people, to make, usability options for people that, need assistance, to enjoy, a game to the fullest. And I think, approaching those things in a inclusive and that sort of way, I think is a really cool, a really good thing that's sort of being worked on. And then for like, I can't speak, specifically to like, the intent of like, casual play versus like, super highly competitive. play. But I think it's always, for me, it's like I love to see what people do with things. And so like for authorial intent in gameplay, like you can put something out, and as long as it's sort of like, you know, it encapsulates what you want as a designer, and the things that people are able to do with it aren't like completely like destroying and crashing the game. Like I feel like there's such a neat, so you know, with speedrunning and doing sort of like glitchy runs, like finding those little things that are, you know, things that you can just kind of play with and have fun with. Like I think, you know, to not intentionally shut those things out, I think is a cool thing.
Yeah, like as a speedrunner and game designer, like one thing, it's been great to learn how speedrunners approach some games, and like I'm now actively trying to leave some doors open so that, I'm not gonna lock this game completely down, so long as like, the person who are like the expected gameplay, the expected player will still have a great time, but people who want to just have a lot of like, just go completely outside of everything and finish the game very quickly, or find other ways to have fun with it, like that's cool. If there like many different people can enjoy a thing I made. I can only speak for myself, but I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
I think a lot of that gets into stuff like cheating and stuff too.
Yeah.
You know, like there are, you know, online games, obviously a very different story.
Sure.
But I like to just load up cheat engine and break a game.
Yes.
And just see where it goes. You know, it's like, hey, Dead Cells, what if I could infinitely jump? What does that even do? And just mess around with stuff that way. It's a good time. It's not necessarily how the developers intended, but also that game has Steam Workshop support. So at some point, they're almost opening the door to say like, hey, figure something out.
Yeah.
You know, mods and all that stuff definitely lead to that as well.
I think the more options to play a game, the more people that can play a game, the better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
So that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for
Thank you so much.
everything.